Daniel heard the second knock before he heard the first. That was how his brain worked lately. Always a beat behind, like he was watching his own life through a delay. He didn't ask what it was about. He already knew in the loose, formless way you know a storm is coming before the sky changes color. Reagan hadn't answered his calls in 2 days. His mother's last text had said, "We just want you to be honest with us," which in his family had never once meant what it said. Daniel Marsh? The officer's hand was near his holster, not on it. Procedure, not threat. Step out of the car. He did. Slowly, palms visible, the way you learn to move when you've spent a lifetime being the one people already suspect. The cuffs were cold, then not cold. He didn't flinch when they clicked shut. He'd been bracing for something like this for years. Not this exactly, but a version of this. The particular felony didn't matter as much as the shape of it. Something broken, someone else's hands on the wheel, and his name arriving at the scene first hit and run. Corner of 5th and Lindell. Tuesday night. He hadn't been anywhere near 5th and Lindell on Tuesday night. He'd been in his apartment, alone, eating cereal for dinner, because he hadn't had the energy to be a person that day. But he also knew, with the flat certainty of long experience, that knowing you're innocent and being believed were two entirely different currencies in his family, and only one of them had ever been in circulation for him. They were already halfway through dinner when the story reached them, softened into a headline. "The police have someone in custody." His mother pressed her palm to her chest like she'd been personally spared something. His father poured wine he didn't usually pour. Reagan sat very still, fork motionless over her plate, and said nothing, which for Reagan was its own kind of performance. "I always worried it would be him," his mother said quietly. Not cruelly, just tired in a way that made it worse. "He's always been, I don't know, reckless in that quiet way." Nobody asked what evidence there was. Nobody needed to. Daniel had spent 30 years auditioning for the role of the one things happened to, and the family had long since stopped bothering to recast. At the precinct, Daniel answered every question in the fewest words that were still true. Where he'd been. What he'd been doing. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't perform the wounded indignity that innocent men were supposed to perform on television, because he'd learned, growing up, that indignation only ever read to his family as guilt trying too hard. "You seem calm," the detective said, not unkindly, more curious than accusing. "I've had practice," Daniel said, and didn't explain further. He asked for two things before they left him in the room alone. His phone carrier records for Tuesday night, and the traffic camera 2 blocks north of the intersection. The one bolted to the light outside the pharmacy. The one most people forgot existed, because it had been there so long it had become part of the architecture. The detective wrote both down without much expression. It wasn't a request that screamed innocence. It was a request that sounded like someone who understood, better than most, how these things eventually got sorted. Slowly, administratively, without anyone's permission or apology. 2 days passed, then 3. Daniel sat in his apartment eating cereal again, this time because it felt correct, a kind of ritual continuity, and did not call his parents. They did not call him. He thought, without much bitterness left in the thinking, about the small increments that had built to this. Reagan borrowing his car just for an hour, and returning it 4 hours later with a different smell in the cabin, and no explanation offered or asked for. His father's specific fondness for the phrase, "the responsible one," delivered like a compliment, functioning like a leash. The particular exhaustion of being trusted only with blame. He wasn't waiting to be vindicated. He'd stopped expecting vindication somewhere around age 19. He was waiting, simply, for the paperwork to catch up to the truth, the way it usually eventually did, in its slow and indifferent way. The call came on a Thursday. Not to Daniel. "To Reagan, we'd like you to come in and clarify a few things." Nobody told Daniel the details. Not right away. But the shift in the family group chat was immediate and unmistakable, a silence where noise used to be. His mother's message, 3 hours later. "Can we talk?" No explanation, no apology yet. Just the small, involuntary flinch of people recalibrating who they'd been wrong about. He learned later, secondhand, in fragments, time-stamped from the pharmacy camera that placed a car matching Reagan's outside the intersection at 9:41 p.m., 17 minutes before the impact was reported. A phone location that put her half a mile closer to 5th and Lindell than she'd claimed. None of it dramatic. All of it simply accurate, finally, after several days of not being asked for. There was no scene where his mother wept and begged forgiveness. There was a phone call where she said carefully, "We should have asked more questions." And Daniel said, "Yeah." And neither of them said much else, because 30 years doesn't get resolved in a single sentence, however true. He wasn't angry, exactly, when he sat by his window that evening. Angry required more energy than he had left for this particular family. What he felt instead was something quieter and harder to name. Not victory, nothing like celebration. Just the strange, unglamorous relief of being right without anyone owing him anything for it. His phone buzzed. Reagan. He didn't answer. Outside, the traffic moved the way it always did, indifferent. And Daniel thought that maybe this was what it looked like when the truth finally arrived. Not as thunder, but as a quiet correction nobody had asked him to forgive. He put his phone face down on the table and made himself dinner. Something real this time, not cereal. A small, deliberate act of taking his own evening back. The family would recover, in its way. It always did. But something in the architecture of it had shifted, permanently, without ceremony, the kind of shift you don't celebrate, because celebrating would mean pretending it hadn't cost anything to get here.